Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. If you're joining live, welcome. If you're watching the recording, thanks for tuning in as well. My name is Matt Penberthy. I'm the Agricultural Land Easement Program Coordinator with the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts, and also work with the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service here in Oregon. And today we'll be doing a deep dive into land eligibility for the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, specifically the agricultural land easements part of the program. I am also joined by Eric Mogenberg, who is my supervisor, the Easement Programs Manager in Oregon. Eric, did you just want to say a quick hello? I'll stop sharing if you'd like.
Good morning, everyone. Eric Mogenberg, NRCS ACEP Coordinator, Program Manager, and I'm based in the Redmond office. Just here to answer any questions if Matt has or anyone else has. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Sharing here. Okay, sorry about that. So thanks again for joining. This webinar will be recorded and posted onto COLT's website after. I did want to share a little bit about the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts before we dive in, since a number of different folks might be accessing this presentation. So in case you're unfamiliar, the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts, we serve and strengthen the land trust community in Oregon. And we primarily do that by building connections between our land trusts and advancing policies that help protect our natural world. And we basically help provide services to our land trusts, including pro bono legal services. We run the Oregon Land Justice Program, which provides connections to our tribal and indigenous communities in Oregon with land trusts. And all of our services help our coalition members do what they do best, which is protecting natural lands, providing recreation, access, and protecting drinking water, and much more. Also, in case folks are unfamiliar of why COLT and NRCS are in this partnership, COLT and NRCS have common goals. So we want to improve the program delivery of NRCS easement programs through more effective communication, transparency, and efficiency. We want to provide education to eligible entities and to landowners about NRCS easement programs and opportunities. And we also want to increase the number of successful applications and easements closed in Oregon. And just a bit of context under this partnership agreement, COLT hired an agricultural land easement program coordinator, which is myself. And we, through this role, I help provide education and training to our land trusts and other partners. I assist NRCS with easement application development and application processing. And I also assist NRCS with the easement acquisition process, closing, and monitoring. So for today's agenda, we'll have about a 45-minute presentation where I'll give an overview of entity health easement programs, and then we'll start to get into the basics of land eligibility. And then we will cover access eligibility, and then we'll get into a lot of the details of the specific eligibility categories, which there's 4 of those. And when we'll talk about ineligibility factors, specifically focusing in on hazardous materials and title exceptions and title details. Then we'll have time for some Q&A. And I also have some notes that the information being presented today is based on current Farm Bill policy. So this is the 2018 Farm Bill. There is currently the Congress is working through a new Farm Bill, which could be passed this year or sometime in the near future, but information today is just based on 2018 Farm Bill. I will also not be presenting about entity or landowner eligibility. Those information about those eligibility requirements are available, and I'll reference those throughout the presentation. And I will also be putting on some additional webinars in the future about those topics. And lastly, the information presented today is relevant to all applicants, though some Oregon-specific details will be shared. So I will recommend to contact your respective NRCS state office if you happen to be watching this from a different state. All right, so scratching the surface here, there are two primary entity held easement opportunities, the first of which is what we'll talk about today, is the ACEP-ALE program. You might hear me say ALE, ALE, it's all the same thing. This is the main program that protects properties from non-agricultural uses. And then there's also the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, specifically entity held easements, or RCPP-EHE. This allows for various types of easements ranging from minimally restrictive to highly restrictive, and that's referring to the deed terms that are eventually put in place. And I will note here, we're going to talk a little bit about forest land today, but under RCPP, there is no restriction onto the of the non-industrial private forest land cover that's allowed within an easement area. And we'll talk about what that looks like for ACEP-ALE versus RCPP-EHE. All right, a little bit about the basics of the ACEP-ALE program. First things first is that, of course, there are eligibility requirements that need to be met, including entity, land, and landowner eligibility. These are set forth in program statute, which is the Code of Federal Regulations, and which are further defined in our program rules, which is the Title 440, Part 528 program manual. There are certain entity responsibilities as well. So the program requires an entity like a land trust, soil and water conservation district, or a tribe or others to be eligible to participate in the program. And that entity eligibility is recognized by establishing a program agreement first, which basically sets out the responsibilities that NRCS has during the life of interacting with the program and the responsibilities of the eligible entity. And from there, the entity will apply, acquire, and manage an easement in perpetuity. There's also ranking factors associated with the program. So applications are ranked on a set of criteria, which is set by NRCS National and by NRCS state offices. The ranking criteria are publicly available each year on the NRCS Oregon website and are updated every year to be with the best and newest information available. Applications are selected in ranking order based on available funding in Oregon, which is typically about $1 to $2 million annually. And NRCS funding, we can provide up to 50% of the purchase price of an easement, which is paid to the entity and then gets paid to your landowners that you're working with. There is another involvement option, which we'll talk about in more detail, the Grasslands of Special Environmental Significance, or GSS, which can provide up to 75% of the purchase price of an easement. And all that funding gets obligated through what's called a parcel contract. And then lastly, there are match funding requirements. So the entities, land trusts, SWCDs, et cetera, are required to obtain match funding for the purchase of an easement, which could include a variety of sources like philanthropic foundation grants, private donations, a landowner donation of land value, or state government grants, which here in Oregon, the applicable program would be the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program, or OAHP. All right, let's get into some of the land eligibility basics that applies to all applications. So, of course, the land must be private or tribal land that is agricultural land, such as a farm or ranch. Land must also be in at least one of the following uses. It could be cropland, rangeland, grassland, or land that contains forests, shrubs, for which grazing is the predominant use. It could also be located in an area that has been historically dominated by grasses, forbs, or shrubs. And it could also be non-industrial private forest land. And I will talk about some additional details here with forest land. So The NRCS definition of a forest is at least 10% stocked by a single-stemmed woody species of any size that will be at least 13 feet tall at maturity. And essentially this equates to 25% canopy cover or greater. And so forest land eligibility for a general ALE enrollment, not eligible for the grasslands of special environmental significance, which again, we'll talk about that later, is that forest land cannot exceed two-thirds of the offered easement area without a waiver. A waiver may be granted if NRCS state conservationist determines that the forest is a sugar bush operation that contributes to the economic viability of the operation. So it is common that we see like riparian buffers, which is more or less could be comprised of forest land. And those are generally eligible, if it doesn't go over the two-thirds easement area. So I do want to highlight documentation. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the documentation requirements today. This is more so just like the eligibility requirements. I do typically put on an annual application workshop that walks through the documentation in more detail. But I do want to highlight at least that all documentation to support land eligibility for your offered easement area is listed on the NRCS Oregon Parcel Application Packet. This is a form that we develop at the state level that helps determine eligibility, and it helps Oregon rank your application. And so this packet is available each fiscal year on our website there on the right-hand side, and it's just a screenshot of the first page on the bottom. And some of the contents in there, there's an introduction letter which has some information about the program, how to complete the packet. It has an application checklist, so that walks through all the required and supplemental forms that are needed for a complete application. It has a parcel questionnaire, which consists of 70 or 80 questions, which all of which are not answered. There's a sort of branching logic where if you answer yes to some questions, there might be additional questions to answer. And then there's also some helpful appendices in there. So moving into access eligibility, NRCS requires sufficient physical and legal access to the entire easement area. And this is also important for non-contiguous parcels. Each parcel, so for example, if there's a parcel A over here, about 500 acres, and then maybe a half mile away, there's parcel B, that is 1,000 acres. Those are considered non-contiguous, and they both must have physical and legal access to them. So physical access is sufficient if NRCS can reliably and safely and efficiently conduct on-site physical inspections. So a bad example of this would be a property with, yes, good public road frontage, but there's obstructions in a way, right? Like a guardrail, or maybe there's a thick forest stand right in front. You can't access the property physically through that way if there's no driveway or some sort of road or pathway that a vehicle can cross over. So that would be our best example, is where there's a public road frontage with driveway accessible. Legal access is sufficient if it is an insurable, unconditional, and transferable legal right. So typically access from a public road is best, or if there is access over and across private neighboring lands, and there's some sort of easement that is insurable, unconditional, and transferable, that would be also acceptable. So typically the documentation you would provide, especially if it's from a public road, would be a map clearly showing direct access from those public roads or private lands. And then if there's private land, a legal agreement or an easement that demonstrates sufficient legal access. And I did include, with permission from Oregon Ag Trust, a more or less redacted map here. As you can see, there's a couple of green rectangles on there that crosses out the road names. But here they show the offered easement area in red, and all of the kind of points of access along public roads there. And this was a successful project that we have funded. So this is a good example of a map to produce. So there is alternative legal access option available. So this is when NRCS determines that that access does not satisfy the requirements just mentioned. Applicants may seek alternative legal access approval across lands owned by the United States. So applicants must first demonstrate that it is not practical to access the parcel as previously mentioned by providing a map of the parcel landlocked by federal lands. If it's not landlocked by federal lands, you should provide proof that the landowner has attempted to obtain access via non-federal lands, though it may not have success in getting access across those non-federal lands. So alternative legal access approval may be granted if there is sufficient proof of one of the following. I'm going to skip to the bottom two as those are the most successful that we've seen and are typically provide the most sufficient proof of legal access. So long-term access permits issued by a federal agency, typically 30 years or greater in length, are ideal, or a letter from an authorized representative of a federal agency establishing the landowner's permission to cross the federal land for casual use is also an ideal form of alternative legal access. So I have some tips for alternative legal access. First, you should definitely work with your landowners and confirm if the parcels will require alternative legal access early. So you should be discussing this with the landowners during your initial conversations or at a first site visit. Ask them, especially if there's non-contiguous parcels, how they get to each property, if they have any sort of permit or approval from the federal agency to cross federal lands. And I also recommend following the ACEP-ALE timeline guide. This is a guide that COLT made for Oregon applicants. It walks through how to apply for the program, and I recommend May as the ideal time to start discussing alternative legal access with NRCS. If you're planning to apply in the fall, sorry, recommend May if you're applying in the fall. Then you would determine the documentation that is available or can be made available for your parcels. So again, permits or a letter provided by the federal agency are ideal. And if there are non-contiguous parcels, like I mentioned, that require alternative legal access, requests and documentation must be made available for each parcel. It is possible too that NRCS may, upon applying, NRCS may suggest a separate application, a completely separate easement application for those non-contiguous parcels. There's not super clear guidance on how we're addressing non-contiguous parcels at this moment, so it is possible that we may suggest a separate application. So continued on the tips for alternative legal access, you can request alternative legal access review either prior to or with your application. And then NRCS will review your request alongside the rest of your application materials. If you do not submit a request prior to or with your application, NRCS will identify if alternative legal access is required. And in that review, we should provide a letter to you explaining the requirements for alternative legal access and the deadlines to address that. So once you submit your application, we'll send you a letter. And alternative legal access should ultimately be reviewed by NRCS and approved or denied prior to application ranking. That when we can only rank eligible applications, and since access is an eligibility requirement, we would need alternative legal access approval prior to that ranking. So if your request is denied, the parcels may be ineligible if there are no further options to obtain sufficient proof of access. Okay, so moving on from some of the general eligibility requirements, we're going to now get into the 4 specific categories that you can choose that depending on what meets the landowner's goals and what fits the property best. So there's a prime soils category, there's a historical/archaeological, There's a protects grazing uses category, and then separately there is that grasslands of special environmental significance enrollment. I'm just going to say GSS from here on out to save my verbiage there. And the last category is the furthers a state or local policy category. All right, starting out with prime soils. So the eligibility requirements for this category is that a parcel must be comprised of at least 50% prime, unique, or locally important soil designations as determined by NRCS. And further, if there are prime if drained or prime if irrigated soils, these may be considered eligible if they are currently in the condition to be prime. So if they're drained or irrigated, and the management of such systems should be addressed in the conservation easement deed and baseline documentation. The documentation to provide here is a map of prime soils within the parcel. And I'll show you an example in a moment. And what you use to obtain this map is the Web Soil Survey. So this is a system that NRCS administers, and you specifically would explore this using the farmland classification report, and you can produce a map from there. And there is an appendix in the parcel application packet that describes how to produce a prime soils map. It walks you through it. And some other notes is that this is the most common eligibility category in Oregon. There are no specific D terms required with this eligibility category. So if you're eligible, there's no D terms that automatically must be included. So in that sense, it's kind of the easiest category to go for if there are more than 50% prime soils on the parcel. So here's an example map again of the same project that we looked at for the access map with some of the information redacted there. As you can see, this property, if you look at the table on the right, it's over largely, I think the largest percentage there is 70.1%, yeah, for prime soils there. So this one clearly meets the prime soils eligibility category, and we can move on with the application from there. So the second eligibility category is the historical/archaeological. This is where the parcel must contain such resources and be one or more of the following. It must be formally listed in the National Register of Historic Places. It could be formally listed in the state or tribal register of historic places. It could be formally determined eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places or by the state or tribal historic preservation office or by the keeper of the National Register. Or it could be included in the state or local tribal inventory with written justification as to why it is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And so the documentation you would provide here is any formal documents of any of the above, and you would also produce a map identifying the location, number, and acres of sites. This is not a common category to apply for in Oregon. In fact, I don't think we've seen any applications come in through this category. There are specific D terms required, which I will get into all the details on the next couple slides here. So if your application is determined eligible and or ranking points are awarded and the parcel is selected for funding, the easement deed must address the protection of the historical or archaeological resources as required by the Secretary of Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties. And it must identify at least one grantee or a third party with designated monitoring responsibilities that has experience essentially in monitoring these types of resources. If there are such resources present, any historical or archaeological resources, you basically have two options and outcomes here. So option one would be to apply for the eligibility category or request NRCS to assess for ranking points, and then ranking points are awarded. The outcome with this option is that the D terms are required that we just talked about. So why would you choose this option? If you would choose this option if you and the landowner have shared goals to protect significant historical resources, or maybe you have a desire to increase your chances of funding by earning more ranking points, since you don't have to apply for this category, but you can request, if there are historic resources, you can request NRCS to assess it for those ranking points, and you could earn more ranking points, which may bump your application over another application. Option 2 is to not apply for this eligibility category and or do not request NRCS to assess for ranking points, and then therefore points are not awarded. And then the result will be that these D terms are not required because you're not applying, or you're not getting those ranking points. So why would you choose this option? You choose this if there's no presence of historical resources, or you might choose this if there is a presence, but the entity and the landowner do not agree to the required D terms. And we have seen this happen where there are historical resources on the property, but the entity has chosen not to request NRCS to assess it for ranking points because they don't want to apply the required D terms. So just wanted to spell that out because I don't know if this has been spelled out in the past before. So overall, highly recommend to follow the Oregon parcel application packet to complete this eligibility section appropriately. It explains through all the things I just talked about too. So definitely feel free to refer to that or reach out if you have any questions. Moving on to the third eligibility category, this is the protects grazing uses as a general ALE enrollment. So here the land must be one of the following: must be grassland, range, pasture, or land that contains forbs or shrubs, which grazing is the predominant use. It could also be land that was historically dominated by one of the above, or has been restored to such conditions, or the eligible entity has a funded restoration plan. And if it meets this specific bullet, the land must also provide or could provide habitat for animals or plants of significant ecological value, or it would address state, regional, or national conservation priorities. The documentation you provide here is a land cover map of all the land types describing the above and the grazed acres on the property. And there are also several questions in the parcel application packet that provide some additional eligibility information for this category. Some other notes: this is a common category, especially for Eastern Oregon. There are specific D terms required, which I'll get into those on the next slide. And then again, our GSS enrollment option, not a general enrollment, it does offer additional NRCS funding up to 75% with more specific eligibility requirements that I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes as well. Okay, so when you apply for this category, the easement deed must limit crop cultivation to no more than 10% of the offered easement area or the parcel. So these are considered designated crop cultivation areas, and if the entity and the landowner include those, they must be attached as an exhibit to the easement deed. This limit does include areas that are already in crop production at the time of application. So overall, I would recommend to identify potential crop areas even if there are no plans to cultivate at the time of application. This may allow some flexibility for the future operation. So in 100 years, 200 years, perhaps the new landowner may want to grow crops. And if you include those crop areas at the time of enrollment, then you're allowing for that flexibility into the future. All right, getting into a more specific enrollment option, that GSS enrollment. The eligibility requirements here, include that the land must be range, pasture, shrubland, or wet meadows dominated by native grasses or grass-like plants, shrubs, or forbs. And it could also be improved or naturalized pasture, range, or wet meadows. The land must also provide or could provide habitat for T&E species or at-risk species, It could also protect sensitive or declining native prairie or grasslands or other highly sensitive natural resources. It must contain little or no noxious or invasive species. And it must also be threatened by non-grassland conversion. I do want to highlight some Oregon qualifications, which we set last fiscal year after a collaborative effort amongst NRCS technical staff and the State Technical Advisory Committee. And we set these in sort of a clarification of national interpretations of recent national interpretations of GSS policy, and we wanted to align our state processes with the national guidance and interpretation. So we further clarified that little or no noxious or invasive species is defined as no more than 10% of the parcel area. We also clarified that forest land is generally not eligible and must be removed, but we do allow some extent of like a feathered edge. So for Eastern Oregon, we set that pine encroachment or invasive juniper cannot exceed 5% of the parcel area. And in Western Oregon, oaks on savanna cannot exceed 20% of the parcel area. So for GSS specifically, the documentation you'd provide is a land cover map of all the land types, describing those GSS areas and grazed areas. There are several specific questions in the parcel application packet to provide for this enrollment option as well. And most importantly, NRCS Oregon, in coordination with our basin level staff, we will go out and conduct an on-site GSS determination. And that will mostly pinpoint the presence of invasive species and any tree presence as well. This is a common category applied for in Eastern Oregon especially. There are specific D terms required, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And then, as I mentioned before, if you're eligible and awarded funding, NRCS could provide up to 75% of the easement purchase. All right, so some tips on applying to GSS. First things is to use a new NRCS Oregon GSS priority area map, and I understand Washington also has a GSS priority area map. We use this map to help identify potentially eligible areas. This map does not mean that these areas are eligible. They just have a higher priority for potentially being eligible based on the best data that NRCS, our staff, collaborated on this map over the last year, and we identified a number of data sets to help us identify these areas. So this might be a good communication tool or a good tool for you, for land trusts or other entities to go out to certain landowners or certain areas and see if they would be interested in an easement, especially a GSS easement. And in general, definitely recommend meeting with the NRCS state office early on. And again, you can refer to the ACEP-ALE timeline guide. We can walk through the eligibility requirements pertaining to your project and begin coordinating that on-site GSS determination prior to submitting the application, so that we know if it could possibly be eligible before you even submit your application, and save some time that way. So once if your application is eligible and approved, the easement deed must then prohibit the cultivation of crops and the conversion of grassland to cropland. So therefore, cropland is not allowed at the time of application or enrollment. And it must also include a provision that new roads are to be constructed in a location and manner that will not negatively impact the habitat, species, or sensitive natural resources identified for protection. And then essentially the same thing with fences. Any maintenance or new construction of fences cannot negatively impact the natural resources identified for protection. The last eligibility category is the furthers of state or local policy. So the eligibility requirements here is that the policy must be consistent with the purposes of ACEP-ALE, and the protection of the parcel must further the state or local policy. So it must help achieve the goals of that policy. Some examples of state or local policies are laws that identify ag preservation priorities, could be an area identified in a government's comprehensive plan, resolution, or other official publication. It could also be a wildlife action plan or a similar document. Thought I had one more, but some examples of areas targeted by such state or local policies include ag areas experiencing high development pressure or threat, historic or other culturally important soils that do not meet the prime soils category, ag areas that support maybe bird flyways or threatened and endangered species or other conservation priorities, or potentially historic or culturally important ag areas as well. Some other notes about the state or local policy category. This is an uncommon category applied for in Oregon. However, I do believe this would be a good option for pretty much all applications given our robust land use regulations and the requirement for all counties to identify resource lands and exclusive farm use zones so that those comprehensive plans are likely good or would likely meet this eligibility category. And you should also, I also recommend to complete the NRCS Oregon parcel application packet for this section. Just follow those instructions and it'll identify the type of documentation that you need to provide if you're applying to this category. And when it comes to the D terms, the easement deed, if you're eligible and approved for funding, the easement deed must address the ACEP-ALE purposes that are being supported by a specific state or local policy. Okay, covered a lot of the eligibility requirements. Now we're going to talk about what may render a parcel application ineligible. So I'm going to focus in on hazardous materials and title exceptions and details in a bit more specificity. So again, in addition to all of the landowner, and entity eligibility requirements that must be met, the following could render an application ineligible. Land cannot be already owned by a federal, state, or local government or an NGO. Land cannot be subject to an easement or deed restriction that provides similar protection or restoration as determined by NRCS. Land where the purposes of the program would be undermined due to on-site or off-site conditions like hazardous materials. Land that NRCS determines to have unacceptable exceptions to clear title or insufficient legal access. And then land where essentially there are third-party mineral rights, maybe for land essentially where there are third-party rights, for example, like mineral rights that are incompatible with the terms of the ACEP-ALE easement. And like I mentioned, I'm going to focus in on these two here, the one about hazardous materials presence and another about unacceptable exceptions to clear title. So moving into adverse on-site or off-site conditions, NRCS does require a limited phase 1 environmental assessment for all applications. The limited phase 1 consists of an on-site environmental assessment conducted by the state office. This is roughly a 4-hour interview and tour with the landowner. And then we conduct a environmental database record search and review. And then NRCS National reviews all of this information and they produce a risk assessment. And this might identify data gaps for the state to follow up on. And just in a bit more detail, our on-site environmental assessment collects info about the current and historical conditions on a number of things. So things like the buildings and other structures, storage tanks, invasive species. And we have 3 primary forms that we fill out and ask the landowner a bunch of information. So why must NRCS complete the limited phase 1? So overall, all federal agencies must comply with the National Environmental Policy Act regulations. And NRCS further determined that the limited phase one is sufficient to comply with these regulations. Also, in addition, the USDA maintains some third-party rights and responsibilities by providing funding for easement purchase. And the courts have basically upheld that parties to the easement may be responsible for remediating any hazardous materials, even if caused by a previous owner. Those cleanups are very expensive, so it is important that NRCS basically conducts like a pre-purchase home inspection for the easement, and then we'll assess if any of the conditions will affect the easement's ability to meet program eligibility. So it's important to note that the easement, the limited phase one may determine that an easement is ineligible at the time of application. NRCS may conduct or pay for a full phase one if the limited phase one requires further information to determine eligibility. And then if the limited phase one or full phase one determines that hazardous materials present require a phase two, then the parcel is ineligible. We'll also note that the limited phase one does assess nearby conditions, including future planned or zoned uses, which may also render an easement ineligible. And further, if there's any adverse conditions that are discovered after your application is approved and prior to NRCS paying on the easement, the parcel may be ineligible and canceled unless there are sufficient, unless the materials are remedied in some type of way. So another tip here is that the entity may provide a full phase one at the time of application to satisfy NRCS's requirement to conduct a limited phase one. I know that sometimes that usually this doesn't happen because why would you pay for a full phase one if you're not sure if your project will even get funded, which is totally understandable. But if you do provide it, it may save some time as we process the application. And a little bit of details about title. So we do require a title report or preliminary title commitment with the application. The report should include all of the exceptions of record with their original documents included in some type of way. Unacceptable exceptions typically include those that have a high likelihood of converting the parcel to non-ag or non-grassland uses, allow a scope or intensity of use that could interfere with the ag use or viability. The exceptions may also limit the entity's monitoring or enforcement ability, or it may include mortgages that cannot be removed or subordinated. So some tips on title is to review the NRCS title exceptions guide to understand any actions needed for specific exceptions, and I included just a screenshot of some of those examples to the right. Acceptable title is required prior to payment or closing. So if there's any exceptions that can't be cleared that could impact the effectiveness of the easement, then a parcel may be deemed ineligible up to payment or closing. And last note here is that title insurance is required for ACEP-ALE. Overall, as you're working on any applications, I highly recommend using the ACEP-ALE timeline guide to plan and align your processes with the federal processes. And I have a specific note here about title is to really dig in early into those title exceptions early, as thorough enough as you can be that is feasible, because you want to really look and see what title exceptions are not only may affect eligibility for NRCS programs, but title exceptions that are feasible to work through. If there's especially complicated ones, it may not be a good project for your land trust or for NRCS as well. The guide is available on the Coalition of Oregon Land Trust webpage. And I also did a presentation about this in August 2025 that is recorded and also on COLT's webpage. Okay, I'm a little over time, so I'm going to just breeze through. There's some resources available here, including from our partners, the American Farmland Trust and Land Trust Alliance. Highly recommend checking out their toolkits. They're very helpful both for entities and for landowners. And of course, you have easement staff available to help, which is Eric and I. Future webinar topics, I'd love to do a deep dive onto ranking criteria. So what makes a project competitive in Oregon? I'd love to also focus on more specifically about the D terms and long-term management related topics and others. So if you have any suggestions or ideas, please feel free to reach out. Love to get more guest speakers and maybe some project examples in all of these presentations as well. That's definitely a goal for this year. Okay, so moving into Q&A, got about 10 minutes. And I see some folks have dropped off, which is okay. Hopefully people will check out the recording as well. So feel free to come off mute or type anything in the chat. I don't hear any takers. Or Vicky, do you have a question?
Well, yes, thank you very much. I was just curious, with all the changes in federal funding, et cetera, what is your projection as to how well this will fare in the next few years, assuming there is a new farm bill that passes?
Yeah, well, I think I have good news there. We are NRCS, so I kind of work in both
Right.
sides here. The chief of NRCS is emphasizing ACEP-ALE as the #1 priority for NRCS period overall. We are losing a rapid amount of farmland and ranch land every day, and she has identified this as a clear priority. She presented streamlining efforts about a month or so ago, where Eric was at that presentation. And so they want to, improve the contracting process, the acquisition process. And I know the new farm bill as well will have some additional improvements, including removing if it passes in this way, but removing the adjusted gross income requirements for landowners just under ACEP-ALE, which will be a big help to improving the program. I can't think of other ones off the top of my head, but I think overall things look strong for this program moving forward, and I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you so much for this. This is great information.
Thanks, Vicky. Appreciate it. I think with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks so much for joining. And if you're watching the recording, thanks for watching, and feel free to reach out to myself or Eric at NRCS Oregon with any questions about ACEP-ALE, or if there's anything Coalition of Oregon Land Trust related, you can reach out to myself or Carson Kendrick as well. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Matt.